This is the Climate Academy Systems Understanding course, and this is Chapter 12 on the Psychology of Climate Change, Part 2. Everything which I'm going to say here can be found inside the Climate Academy student book, and after you've listened to this or read the text, you can go onto the Climate Academy Moodle and answer some simple multiple choice questions just to show that you have assimilated this knowledge. And I'm going to start with Karl Marx. We're going to finish with Thomas Paine, and both of them can be found inside here. And in between those two bookends, I'm going to indulge some other philosophers, my friends Sigmund Freud, Karl Popper, Hannah Arendt, to help us really get to the bottom of what's going on at a psychological level in this mad climate crisis. So we're going to start with Karl Marx on the grammar of our thinking. And this might be a surprising place to start, because immediately people may think that I'm some kind of watermelon. Green on the outside with environmental concerns, but really on the inside, this deep communist red. It also might be surprising to start with Karl Marx, because a lot of the communist regimes which followed on from Marxist theory, for Russia and Eastern Europe, these are scarred. The histories of those countries have been scarred by environmental damage. The most famous of the Aral Sea, which shrank, or the heavy industry of Eastern Europe, or most famously the meltdown of the reactor 4 in Chernobyl. Now, given that we have a bad start, it has to be worth it to drag Marx onto the stage to help us think through climate change. And of course, it is worth it. And it's worth it because Karl Marx was, in fact, not just an economist. His economic thinking brought him into psychological thinking also. And this is aside from the fact that Karl Marx was extremely concerned with soil, and he did actually have a lot of interest in the environment, which has now been pushed to the side by people who just want to point at him as some kind of gulag maker. So, to the point, Marx's economic theory divides an economy into two components. Early on in his work, he described how every economy essentially has a base and a superstructure. So the base is like the body of an economy, and the superstructure is like the mind of the economy. And perhaps the best way into this is just to talk about my little morning ritual. So I have a coffee in the morning, and I have several when I get to school. And this chemical in my body creates a change in the way in which my mind feels, or the way in which my mind works. So there is, of course, a connection between the body and the mind. They're not two entirely separate entities. And Marx was concerned that if you look at the way in which a body is made up, if you look at the components and the structure of the body, then you can start to understand the way the mind works. You can start to understand how people think. And this distinction between base and superstructure has got a historical context to it. So if I now introduce a second component of Marxist thought, Marxist theory, then we can introduce his idea of the stage theory of history. So Marx's stage theory of history states that human history has gone through various stages, various epochs. And each of these epochs had a different economic base to it. So it starts with primitive communism, then you get slave societies, like let's say the Romans, the Greeks, and so on. Then we had feudalism, famously with knights, kings, queens, and so on. Then there's like a mercantile phase, and then this falls into capitalism. And finally, in the Marxist scheme of things, of history, there was a hope that this capitalist stage would eventually move into a socialist stage and finally into the final unfolding of human history into communism. So Marx understood history as having these phases, and he thought that there were basically laws governing the movement of history as well. So just like Newton understood the laws governing the planets and the movement of bodies on Earth, and Darwin understood the basic laws governing the development of life on Earth through evolution. Well, Marx is in this camp. He thinks that behind all that clutter and all that details, there are some basic laws governing what goes on at the socio-economic level, at like the bodily level of the economy. Right. So we have our two components. We have base and superstructure, and we have our stage theory of history. Now let's pull them together. So what Marx says is that the values of any epoch or any era will be determined by the base. So what you value and what you think is wonderful or beautiful, your spontaneous ethical reaction to things is not innocent, says Marx. Neither is it divine. It's something which is essentially manufactured or artificial, depending on the historical moment that you're living in. So, for example, in the feudal phase, if you were to look at all feudal documents or tapestries like the Bayeux tapestry, or you look in speeches, what you find is that the subtext to all of those documents and all of those texts is a celebration of loyalty, stability, order, obedience, duty, sacrifice. These types of things are just automatically good in that era. They're unquestionably good. And to the point at which, for example, if you're a farmer who is called to stop digging his crops and go to war, and on the battlefield he finds himself in an extremely stressful environment, well, he will experience that moment not as exploitation of his life, but he will experience it as a celebration of his duty to the king or the queen, or a celebration of a sacrifice, or loyalty. So in a funny way, you have this dark situation for him in which his life is not going in a direction that he would have chosen, and yet somehow his psychological experience of that moment is a positive one. I mean, not purely positive, but it acts as a mask or a camouflage or a way to mobilize him, to get him to do something which otherwise he wouldn't do. So in a feudal society, says Marx, these values, the superstructure of the society enables the base to stay in place. The power interests and the economic interests of the base, in this case that the king wants to go to war to conquer France, let's say, then the soldier is there, and his experience, his spontaneous experience of his life, is framed by these values which make that possible. Now, we are evidently not now in a feudal society. We now live in a capitalist society. So the question now is, in this stage of history, given that economic base, what are the superstructure values? What's going on in our mind? And here, it's no coincidence that there's a coherence between the base and the superstructure, because today, what do we value unquestionably? What do we value beyond all else? It's things like choice, freedom, self-maximization, individual choice. So these things are what are unquestionably right. So almost to the point of absurdity. Like, I remember as a kid, Jerry Springer was on the telly, and after school you put on a bit of Jerry Springer just to unwind, and at the end of every Jerry Springer show it didn't matter what the audience thought, booed or hissed or cheered. It didn't matter what the people on the stage said. The thing is that they were choosing their life, and that was the best thing. And you can see this not just in the Jerry Springer Show, you can see it in the subtext to every single advert. That if you were thinking about which shampoo to buy, well, you might well reach out for L'Oreal because you're worth it. Or in the case of Icona Pop, her song, I Love It, it doesn't matter what is happening in that song. She can throw your shit into a bag, throw it down the stairs, she can crash a car into the bridge. She doesn't care. She loves it because she's choosing it. And as we jump and dance along, we all agree that that is the fundamental value in play. It's the same with Bon Jovi and It's My Life and so on and so on. And so, in a capitalist world with a capitalist base where the priorities are profit, shareholder interest, banks, GDP, etc., then it's not a surprise, says Marx, to find that our mind, the superstructure of that culture, plays into the interests of those things, because you need people to have an itch and a continual restlessness about reinventing themselves and choosing things like a Haagen-Dazs ice cream. You know, the invocation is to just indulge yourself. Surely you deserve it. So the superstructure is a product, or in Marxist language, is determined by the base. And this section is about the grammar of things. And it's important to stress that word, because grammatical things are out of sight. When I speak to you now, and I use English, I am reaching out for various Marxist concepts and so on, and various words of English to explain it to you. But what I'm not doing is I'm not thinking about the grammar of it. This is just loaded in. I don't even know many grammatical rules of English. In a previous chapter I went into this. I don't know the adjectival order of sentences in English. If I use 3 adjectives in English, I just say the lazy brown dog. Those 3 words pour out, but I don't know the rules governing that. But there is a set of rules about adjectival order. So you can look at the video on paradigm shifts to find out more. The point is that grammar is a non-negotiable. I cannot me, word, order, choose, must when speak I to you. I have to use the grammatical things which I inherit from centuries of people playing the game of speaking English. So grammatical rules are out of sight. They are non-negotiable. And this is why I use that word to talk about what Karl Marx's insights into psychology are. Because that's exactly how it functions. And you don't realize it. You don't realize that the constellation of values which you live under, this constellation of morals and culture, is something which can shift. It always feels permanent. And I think an interesting way to expose this is to talk about a poster from World War I. So this poster was used to try and get men to mobilize to die in the trenches. Because by this stage of the war, stories were leaking back from the battlefields in Europe that things were not going that well. And so this poster, Daddy, what did you do in the Great War? And the father on the armchair is evidently not really able to answer this question because he stayed at home. Here, the message is absolutely crystal clear. That is, you have a duty to go and fight in the trenches. But it's not on the surface of that poster. This poster is such an effective piece of campaigning by the government to get people to fight in World War I because it worked at a grammatical level. The hidden values of duty, loyalty, sacrifice, and so on, those were what made that poster work. And it's the same in what we now have in capitalism. The hidden grammatical rules to our behavior, the background morality, which we all play under this constellation. It frames our lives, but it's weirdly, although it's controlling, it's out of sight. You cannot today sell a product based on loyalty or sacrifice or duty. It'd be absurd. You can't imagine an advertising campaign which would do that. It just wouldn't work. Do your duty, buy L'Oreal. Do your duty, buy Häagen-Dazs. So, now we've established Marxist theory of the base and superstructure and these stages of history, we can now start to understand a little bit of our psychological reaction to climate change, because that plays out under exactly the same framework. So, what do we find ourselves doing in climate change? What is our natural moral reaction to climate change? It's one of individual action. It's one of individual choice. And we're kind of resistant to the idea that the state should be involved or there should be kind of governmental interference in things. And so these spasms which happen if you start to talk about climate change in terms which demand system responses or legal responses or responses from the government in terms of investment, you suddenly find that it becomes difficult to talk about it. People are very comfortable talking about individual actions, doing recycling, using less plastic, because there what you have is a language and a grammar which fits inside that constellation. And it's just out of tune to speak with a different grammar. You get a massive cognitive dissonance. In fact, a beautiful example for the kind of ethical world that we live in capitalism was described by Zizek in a Starbucks coffee.
Let's turn to the high point of our consumerism. Let me take a drink. Still, some of it, Starbucks coffee. I'm regularly drinking it, I must admit it. But are we aware that when we buy a cappuccino from Starbucks, we also buy quite a lot of ideology? Which ideology?
Zizek points to the fact that when you buy a Starbucks, you don't just buy a Starbucks coffee. What you buy is also a kind of forgiveness by the system at the same time. So often it says on a Starbucks, every Starbucks coffee means that 5 playgrounds are built in Guatemala for children. And so therefore, this price, like your guilt, you can forgive yourself in this coffee by doing your bit for a social issue somewhere else. And so that feels very comfortable. It means that you get to consume, it means that you get to have your coffee, but at the same time, you get forgiven by the system. And what it doesn't do is it doesn't address the structural problems of why you need to support Guatemalan children with playgrounds or schools or education. So you get a distraction or a deflection from asking structural questions.
If you think I'm exaggerating, you have them around the corner, walk into any Starbucks coffee, and you will see how they explicitly tell you, I quote their campaign, it's not just what you are buying, it's what you are buying into. And then they describe it to you. Listen, when you buy Starbucks, whether you realize it or not, you are buying into something bigger than a cup of coffee. You are buying into a coffee ethics. Through our Starbucks Shared Planet program, we purchase more fair trade coffee than any company in the world, ensuring that the farmers who grow the beans receive a fair price for their hard work. And we invest in and improve coffee growing practices and communities around the globe. It's a good coffee karma. And a little bit of the price of a cup of Starbucks coffee helps furnish the place with comfortable chairs and so on and so on. You see, this is what I call cultural capitalism at its purest. You don't just buy a coffee. You buy, in the very consumerist act, you buy your redemption from being only a consumerist. You do something for the environment, you do something to help starving children in Guatemala, you do something to restore the sense of community here, and so on and so on. This, and again, I could have go on like the...
Now let's be clear, it's not that every year the great capitalists get together in some room like the Wizard of Oz and decide on, well, which values are we going to promote this year? Which grammatical structure are we going to have? There's not a Wizard of Oz scenario. This is a vapor which arises from the base. It's not something which is controlled in this explicit, conscious way. It's like a natural product of what is happening at the base. And that's important because even the people inside who are profiting, the bourgeois for Marx, or today we would say CEOs and that kind of thing, even they breathe in this, what Marx calls odorless, colourless gas. And so, to finish, what's important for Marx, and later in Marxist theory, the Frankfurt School especially, they point to the fact that in order to break through this camouflage, art and culture has to be a bit disruptive. People have to be woken up from their sleep. They have to be shown where the exploitation is happening. The superstructure acts as a camouflage to some terrible injustices, like Dickens wrote in A Tale of Two Cities. This was the best of times and the worst of times. Like, capitalism creates massive productivity, massive wealth, and at the same time, terrible inequalities and degradations. And this gap between those two things is really just like unsustainable, but therefore you need to have some kind of drug to mask it. That's why Marx himself talked about the religion being the opium of the people. Marx thought that the only reason you can get workers turning up to work every Monday in a factory which makes them do mechanical, repetitive and automated jobs which don't fulfill their own creativity or sense of well-being. The only reason that work model can be sustained, said Marx, is because on Sunday they are told that the first will be last and the last will be first. Their suffering is given a texture which makes it feel virtuous. The reward will come in the end. And Marx says this drug, this opiate of the people, subdues them into accepting their fate. It subdues them into just getting on with their work in exploitative conditions. So this is Marx's insight into psychology. And today it's not Christianity which is the opiate of the people. Paradoxically, it's consumerism itself. The lottery idea that one day it could be you. You might one day escape from the system, but actually all you're doing is buying into the system. So Marx helps us take our vision deeper beyond just the surface level of our understanding of climate change in terms of vocabulary, and he helps us see like the grammar of things, what's going on at a grammatical level. And you don't have to be, and I'm not a Marxist, you don't have to be a Marxist to understand that this is a very valuable insight into psychology and into the way in which injustices preserve themselves. Some things are so weirdly exploitative. You think, how is it possible that this can carry on? Why do people not see clearly that this is just a rank injustice? Or this, in terms of the environment, is profoundly unsustainable? It's because at the superstructure level, things are being masked, things are being camouflaged. Freud, on defense mechanisms. Let's start with Freudian theory. Just like with Marx, we're going to build his conceptual framework and then we'll apply it to climate change. So what is Freudian theory? Essentially, Freud divides the self into three components, three bits. There is at the bottom the id, at the top there's the superego, and in the middle, caught between those two things, as we'll see, is the ego. So the id at the bottom, this is the place of our illicit desires, our sexual drives, our death drives, kind of destructive energies. And at the top, in the superego, this is what we would call ethics or manners or social expectations that you get from parents, from friends, from church, from culture, from MTV or whatever. But that's like we just saw in the Karl Marx section. It's a bit like the superstructure. So there is the superego. And the problem, says Freud, his central analysis of the human condition, is that there is a conflict between your sexual drive and what is permissible up here at in the superego. So you could say there's a conflict between the pleasure principle and the reality principle. You want to have sex with A, B or C, but it's not okay. And famously, Freud's Oedipal complex says that men want to have sex with their mothers. So let's now talk about the ego, which is stuck in the middle here. So the ego has to navigate, this is the conscious mind, it has to navigate between these two competing forces. And this is a really hard, difficult, endless job. These energies down in the id, the death drive and the sex drive, they don't stop. And an unsuccessful self or a dysfunctional self can't manage or calibrate these competing energies. And so you find the ego indulging in dysfunctional behavior or behavior which is damaging or whatever. So this is the key central Freudian insight. The threefold division of the self and the Oedipal complex in the middle. Now, we can now understand the concept of a Freudian slip. So Freudian slip is when this ego, either through tiredness or stress, doesn't manage to control or correctly filter the things which are at work in the id. And so you, with a slip of the tongue, you reveal the id. You reveal what the subconscious is shouting about, this kind of infantile voice in your head, which is continually asking you to satisfy your desires. And here are some famous Freudian slips on television.
Aaron, again, congratulations on your big Hooters. Hoosiers win.
You said what?
Wow, that was a slip of the tongue.
The team started slowly not picking up Portland's double penetration.
Northwest began serving peanuts this month. Georgia is the top peanut producing.
Sask Energy is announcing a proposal to jack up the cost.
He claims they contain an orgasm
Their third straight loss, 6-4 to Philly last night. Pete Harnish on the mound for the Mets tonight.
On the KTLA Morning News recently, this big showdown between the cities, too. That was an awful word slip.
In Washington, D.C., and also at the Penis Museum in Santa Rosa.
She says it worked for her.
So she's enjoying penis a little bit more, is she?
Word about the president. For 7.5 years, I've worked alongside him, and I'm proud to have been his partner. And we've had triumphs, we've made some mistakes, we've had some setbacks.
I don't know if it's appropriate to confess here, but why not? My own Freudian slip in the early days of teaching. So I was teaching in a boys' school in Bury Grammar, and we sometimes did lessons in the girls' school. And I was teaching the cosmological proof for God's existence to a class of 20 or so teenage girls. I myself was like 22, 23 years old, and I had my overhead projector sheets ready, and I wanted to put them on the overhead projector, the beamer, and it wasn't working. So I gave the plug to one of the students, and what I said was, "Can you plug me in and turn me on?" Now, I would say that's not what I wanted to say, but Freud would say that's exactly what you wanted to say. So Freudian slips reveal what is really going on behind the scenes. I actually interviewed my own son about this. Now, don't worry, this is not about the Oedipal complex. When he was little, like 4 years old, there was a little glitch in his understanding of the world that was about special K. Now, my eldest son, it's called Jules, he was a very meticulous, very tidy, very organized, very careful, considerate little boy. And in terms of language, he was very good. He grew up trilingual, but he didn't ever get the word special K right. So shopping, he would always talk about he wanted special cake. It's like, no son, it's not cake, it's just K. But the problem persisted. And I decided it was about time to just put this on camera. So here's my interview with my son about special K. And essentially the point here is that his subconscious wants it to be cake. I mean, what child doesn't want cake for breakfast? And so this desire overrules his rational mind. And there's this, let's say, perpetual Freudian slip about him wanting cake for breakfast. Here it is.
Oops. Okay, Jude. What have you got in your hands there?
A box of special cake.
Box of special cake?
Yeah, box of special cake.
Is it not cereal?
Yeah.
Yeah, and what? I thought it was special K.
No, Mama says special K.
Oh, and what do you think it is?
Special cake.
Do you like it?
Yeah.
Is it really tasty?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's for the morning when I wake up.
Is it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nice. What do you eat with it?
With strawberries.
Do you? Oh, yeah. And is it your favourite cereal?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
And strawberries is my favourite cereal. It's my favourite cereal as well.
Mm. Does it taste good with milk?
Yeah.
Yeah. But let me just check, because I think it says K on the box. You sure it's not K? It's special K. What is it?
Just the big one.
Yeah.
Special cake. Say special cake, and Mama says special K.
But you just completely, you've no doubt about it. It's special cake.
Yeah.
Even though I've said it 1,000.
Cake.
Yeah, and even though I've said it 1,000 times that it's just special K, you're sure it's special cake.
Yeah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, look.
Oh yeah, okay, I can see that, yeah. Thank you. You say bye-bye to everybody?
Yeah, bye-bye.
Now that clip illustrates another key concept of Freud, which is repression. And there are 10 types of defense mechanisms which we're going to talk about in a moment. But let's just focus in on this one. This is, in a very tight sense, you could even call it disavowal. So Freud's concept of disavowal is the idea that you know very well, but. So here, he knows very well that it is special K. Yeah, Mamo says special K, but he insists it's special cake. So the ability of humans to hold a belief or a set of beliefs, knowing that they're wrong, and carry on anyway. So disavowal is a particular kind of corner of this idea that Freud has about repression. So let's now talk about, finally, in terms of our Freudian concepts, the 10 different defense mechanisms. And this will help us then understand our response to climate change. So there are 10. Denial, projection, turning against the self, sublimation, regression, rationalization, intellectualization, reaction formation, displacement, and fantasy. So 10 defense mechanisms, 10 ways which all of us pretty much every day indulge in. All of us practice these defense mechanisms because life's difficult. And there are many psychological strategies which we have to cope with a difficult life. Now, only one of those, says Freud, is actually constructive or positive, and that's sublimation, but that's for another day. A really good account of these 10 defense mechanisms can be found on the School of Life.
The book laid out for the first time the core idea that we instinctively try to protect our ego, our acceptable picture of who we are, with a variety of defences. The problem is that in the act of defending ourselves against pain in the immediate term, we harm our longer-term chances of dealing with reality, and therefore of developing and maturing as a result. Anna Freud highlighted 10 key types of defence mechanisms. Firstly, denial. Denial is when we don't admit there is a problem. We think things like, I enjoy drinking very much and I sometimes get quite bad hangovers, but I can handle it. If other people try to get us to face up to the problem, we react very badly. The immediate survival mechanism, the short-term instinct to feel all right about oneself, means refusing to recognise our need for change. Projection. In projection, you attribute a bad feeling you have in someone else. For example, you might develop the impression that your partner is going to be extremely critical if you don't make more money this year than last. But in reality, they may be quite understanding and sympathetic. The harsh, bitter thoughts are not in your partner, they're in you, and they came from, let's say, your mother. But you've given the negative feelings, which you don't want to recognise in yourself, to someone else. That's projection.
These defense mechanisms are in play all the time. All of us are guilty of using them to navigate through the complexities of our desires and the complexities of navigating those desires inside a social context. The point of Freud is to become aware of them. The more you understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, the more healthy you are, the more strategies you can control, and the more articulate you can be about yourself, the more you get to set the story and not have the subconscious dominate you. So the ego can gain control of things by understanding the background forces that are in work. So let's take a few of these defense mechanisms and see how they play out with climate change. Because again, Freud isn't, although his theories with the Oedipal complex and so on are essentially pornographic, you don't have to subscribe to that full Oedipal account of Freud to be able to take lessons from his work. Just like with Marx, you don't have to be a full-on Marxist to appreciate some of his psychological insights. Well, here it's the same with Freud. So let's see if we can use Freud's psychological tools to help unpick our situation with climate change. The most obvious place to start with these defense mechanisms is denial, because there are climate deniers. Now, let's not go into that now, it's just common sense. Some people do not want to look at the science and therefore deny it. In the previous chapter, in chapter 11, we unpack some of the psychology that's at work there that enables people to be deniers, even though they're intellectual, even though they're smart. That brain power is mobilized to suppress the data and to keep it out of sight. So, denial is the most famous of these defense mechanisms. The second defense mechanism we might pick up is the notion of regression. So, an infantiling. So, Freud noticed that people might shrink back to childish responses to things as a way to mask or cover up the fact that they don't want to deal with something. And in education on climate change, the reason for me starting the Climate Academy was I think we have an infantile response to the climate crisis in education. We only seem willing to deal with things which could be done in primary school. Simple individualistic projects about recycling and plastic and waste. And we're not ready to engage and look at the full complexity and the depth of the systemic crisis. So that is arguably a type of regression. Sorting things into bins. And again, you could invoke this disavowal thing there, that most people, when they put things in recycling bins, they know that once those bins get taken away, they actually end up in the same place. But the ritual of putting them in the bins is a valuable experience for them. So that kind of disavowal, like, I know very well, but I will still do it. Now, okay, I'm not saying that these things aren't important. I'm not saying that recycling is a bad thing. But the climate change will not be fixed by recycling. The threat to human civilization is a Earth system structural one. It's an existential one. And it requires us to get beyond, far beyond, that kind of very tactile response. Another type of regression arguably could be what we observe in our consumer society. So this type of denial or defense mechanism is like a hyperactivity about growth or about productivity. And that is a distraction from what we truly want, or a distraction from deeper issues. And the funky philosopher Zizek, he gives an example from the movie Psycho, in which Norman Bates, sorry, spoiler alert, has just killed somebody in the shower. And here he is in his normal self, so not dressed up as his mother anymore and stabbing women in showers. Here's Norman Bates, the hotel owner, the reasonable, ego level, conscious, rational, reasonable guy. Here he is after the act cleaning the bathroom. And as he cleans the bathroom, Zizek notices that this scene goes on for 8-9 minutes. And at a zero level, says Zizek, this activity of cleaning is a way of distraction from deeper existential questions of vulnerability, of trauma, whatever. So work at a zero level is a kind of distraction. And this can explain workaholism, or on a macro level, it might help explain our absolute dogmatic commitment to GDP. Like, we just got to keep growing the economy. Like Norman, he's just got to keep cleaning the blood. Like, we don't want to look at the darker realities which are in play. So just at a zero level, work could be seen as a type of distraction, as a type of denial, and at a macro level, a GDP that also works as an analysis. Nietzsche on the shadows of God. Nietzsche is a famous atheist. He's iconoclastic, he's vandalistic, he tore down intellectually many of the standard cultural assumptions of the 19th century. He's seen as the final word on Christian culture in the 19th century. And his excoriating attack on Christianity has a tremendous psychological depth to it. In fact, Nietzsche himself called himself a psychologist before he called himself a philosopher. Another reason for that is that Nietzsche, in some respects, is ending philosophy. So just as he attacks church and Christian beliefs, he's also attacking the project of philosophy itself. So Nietzsche, who is philosophizing with a hammer, he's knocking down some of the basic beliefs that people carried and cultural assumptions. This is a man who can also help us think through climate change. I'm going to be very brief with this because otherwise this whole video series, I could speak for 3 or 4 hours just on Nietzsche himself. So I'm going to pick up one thing about Nietzsche and the death of God and the shadows of God, and the rest I'm going to leave to I have a series on Nietzsche which you can find on YouTube, which takes it step by step. So here's a snapshot of what Nietzsche could help us do in terms of our psychology. Essentially, Nietzsche takes us on a search back through our genealogy, but not a biological one, a moral one. But just like you could do a genealogy of yourself and do a family tree and maybe work out where your brown eyes come from or why you're 6 foot tall or whatever, you can do this with morality, says Nietzsche. You can trace back the current ethical system, the current psychological paradigm which people lived in the 19th century, and you can look back through history and look at its origins. So Nietzsche does this in his book, The Genealogy of Morals. And what he is saying is that when Jesus was born and the Jews were living under Roman occupation.
Can I join your group? Nah, piss off. I didn't want to sell this stuff. It's only a job. I hate the Romans as much as anybody.
Are you sure?
Oh, dead sure. I hate the Romans already.
Listen, if you wanted to join the PFJ, you'd have to really hate the Romans.
I do.
Oh, yeah? How much?
A lot.
And Jesus, as an adult, his response to that occupation, which triggered the spread of Christianity, for Nietzsche was a regrettable turn of events in this genealogy. So Nietzsche doesn't admire Jesus. And like I said, this does not fit squarely with his background. So he's very well versed because of his childhood in Christian beliefs and Christian practices, but ultimately he rejects them. You could say that this is because that his father died when he was just a very young boy, when he was 5 years old. And this existential shock, this collapse of his symbolic order, acted like an earthquake, which triggered a tsunami, which would later crash in his teenage years into this disbelief and this critical view of Christianity. But whatever the reasons for Nietzsche's rejection, his account of Christianity is an interesting one on a psychological level. So I'm going to just share that basic insight that Nietzsche has and see how that then plays out with our society and psychology today. What Nietzsche says is that the Jews were occupied under the Romans, and this occupation was not new. In fact, if you go back through the different empires, before the Romans were the Greeks, before the Greeks were the Persians, before the Persians were the Babylonians, before the Babylonians were the Assyrians, and so on. And each of these occupations diminished the chances of the Jewish people ever getting control back of their territory, because God had promised the Jewish people land and children. But the reality was, and this reality by the time we get to Jesus' time, is that there's no chance that the Jews are going to recover what they had. Because at one point, under King David in about 1000 BC, they had indeed a theocracy. The Jews were in charge of the land of Israel. They could set their own laws, they could practice their religion freely, and so on. But this succession of conquests had reduced that project or that dream to rubble. So there they were, a Jewish people under occupation, and then Jesus enters the frame. Expectation on Jesus would have been to do something to kick out the Romans. There's lots of different voices, a kind of kaleidoscopic voices about what to do about the Romans. You had some people that said you have to be more spiritual. Some said we could maybe activate a second coming of Moses by going into the desert and purifying ourselves. They were called the Essenes. And so there were all these different voices about how to solve the Roman problem. And one of the major voices was that of the Zealots. So this is a group of terrorists who want to kick out the Romans militarily. But this project is doomed to fail because of the sheer size of the Roman Empire. In fact, there were rebellions led by zealots, like the Maccabean rebellion. But each time it was squashed. Each time it was crushed, and the prospect of the Jews recovering their land and the promise of God was made impossible. And it's Jesus's response to this crisis which forms the junction of our morality, says Nietzsche. And Nietzsche says that Jesus does something negative. He makes a move on the chessboard which we have lived with ever since, which Nietzsche doesn't like. So what is that move? Well, essentially, what happens is that if you focus in on the Israelites, and if you look at how they were feeling and their anger towards the Roman Empire in 0 AD, they couldn't discharge that on the Romans. That was not a legitimate thing to do. It wasn't possible for them to do that. They would have been crushed. So this zealot terrorist response to Roman power was not working. There's nothing they could do with this anger. It couldn't be discharged in any legitimate way or achieve anything. So what Nietzsche says happens is that anger, because it has to go somewhere, it falls back on the Israelites themselves. They experience that anger as self-anger, as guilt. So this is a little bit like Freud, and from the previous question, the previous points about energies and how energies can't be stopped, they just have to be channeled. And what Nietzsche says here is that this psychological energy is channeled in a way which is not healthy. So to give it a little bit more detail, if we open up what does this guilt look like, what Nietzsche says is that the Israelites, in this pivotal moment, they had no chance to have power, wealth, status. And so because they couldn't get those things, what they did is they celebrated the opposite. They celebrated poverty, weakness, and humility. So because they couldn't have what they wanted, what they did is that they started to celebrate the things that they had in abundance. Weaknesses. And this plays out like guilt. You celebrate the weaknesses, you celebrate the negative things, you turn inwards on yourself. because the external world, this outside force, is impenetrable. You can't do anything with it. So Nietzsche gives a name to this. It's called the slave revolt, and Nietzsche is revolted by it. He thinks that it has led to a culture in which weaknesses are celebrated and which it promotes a culture of infantile behaviour where people don't square up to problems. Now, whatever we think of Nietzsche's analysis, because I happen to think that humility and love and such things are not necessarily weak. In fact, they're some of the toughest things. Whatever you think about this, there are surely signals of truth in what Nietzsche's saying. And this is a way in which we could understand our response to the climate crisis. We can, in fact, we can understand lots of modern things putting Nietzschean glasses on to analyse the psychology that's at work. For example, I know there are many complex causes of anorexia. As a teacher of teenagers, I've had many experiences having to handle this problem. So it is ridiculously simplistic to say this, but there could be a grain of truth in following this through, in that young people presented with impossible standards of beauty and a powerlessness which comes from that, they turn inwards and they punish themselves. And of course, it doesn't have to be a sense of it doesn't have to be the problem of beauty. It can be any problem. A teenager faced with an impossible problem at home or in school or in their social life. One way in which those negative energies can be channeled is against the self, for example, through an eating disorder. But there are many ways in which it can play out. But the point is that you get agency back. Faced with no agency, this is at least one way in which you recover agency, even though it's negative and self-destructive. And this is what Nietzsche's saying is happening in the slave revolt. In terms of climate change, we could say that the turn inward to the individual carbon footprint follows a similar psychological trajectory. We are faced with massive systemic problems. We are faced with corporations and states which have the destiny of our future in their hands. We are powerless to agitate or to move or manipulate that block of reality. And so what do? We turn inwards. We take that anger and we translate it into a new force, into guilt, into individual guilt, which is destructive. It makes us feel bad, but at least we have an agency. To finish, Nietzsche, in his more famous book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, points at three metamorphoses: the camel, the lion, the child. And what he says is that the culture which he observed around him in the 19th century was like a camel. Camels are load-bearing animals. They go through the deserts and caravans carrying the weight told by their owners to carry. And this, he says, is like the Christian culture. Societies full of people who are just willing, unthinkingly carrying the burdens with them. Nietzsche says you need to go to the next level. You need to wake up to that enslavement. And you should be like a lion. You should be prepared to stand outside from what he calls the herd or the last man type, and be brave like a lion, kind of alpha stance in the universe, and say, no, I will set my own laws. I won't just follow the cultural cliches. And most of Nietzsche's people who read Nietzsche actually stop at this second level of Nietzsche, this lion phase, and they forget the third phase, which is the child. The final phase of human metamorphosis, the final development of humans for Nietzsche, is a childish playfulness, a spontaneity, a joy, a kind of overflowing, a love of the universe in all this kind of messy incomprehensibleness. This third phase of Nietzsche is often forgotten because they just see Nietzsche as the vandal, as the iconoclast, as the destroyer of beliefs, and Nietzsche was also appropriated by the Nazis through his sister, which is completely illegitimate, but he's kind of famous as this aggressive, destructive thinker, like a lion, but they forget the third metamorphosis. And I think this is important for climate change, that first of all, we have to step out of this individual carbon footprint narrative, this guilt narrative. We have to be brave enough to stand and say, no, we're going to think about the framing of this problem. We're going to reframe it. We will not accept the paradigm that everything is operating under because it's dysfunctional, but not out of an aggression or an anger, but out of like a transformative affection of humanity, and one that is full of hope and love and joy and so on and so on. And yeah, Nietzsche's just a wonderful guy. He's such a sharp writer. His German was considered after Goethe to be the best ever written. But he is hard to understand. His work is a little bit fragmentary, it's playful in itself, but hopefully this is a little window on his world, and it might help us, again, just like with Marx, just like with Freud, to develop like a diagnosis of the problem, to step to the side, to see these deeper psychological dynamics which might be at work. Karl Popper and the principle of falsifiability. Popper is a philosopher of science, but as we'll see, his insights into what makes good science will be valid for what makes good psychology, and therefore what makes good responses to climate change. So let's start with the science. The standard view of science, on what good science is that if you have evidence for your theory, the more evidence you have, the better the chances of your theory being good are. This is called the verification principle. And it makes common sense. If I was to throw a pen top in the air several times, and each time gravity happens, then it's reasonable to assume that gravity exists. And the more instances of gravity on show, the more it seems like gravity is operating in this room. So at a very basic level, this is an intuitively correct way in which we approach science, the verification principle. But the problem is that it is sometimes easy to accumulate evidence for a theory that is wrong. I'll give you an example of this. I was driving down to Germany with the family. We'd set off early in the morning on the motorway, and going down the Autobahn in the early hours of the morning, everything was quiet in the car, but suddenly, after like 2 hours of silence, a voice pipes up from the back. It's Jules, my eldest again, the one with the special K. He pops up with a theory. He says, "Papa, I think black cars are fastest." So he has been sat there. I thought he was asleep, but he'd been sat there, and for 2 hours, he had observed this kind of Audi or Porsche black car going past, overtaking us. And after 3 or 4 cars, it had crystallized to a hypothesis in his head that black cars are faster. And once he'd latched onto that hypothesis, every black car that went past confirmed it, and eventually after 2 hours, out popped the theory. Now, the problem is that because he was locked onto black cars, he'd stopped noticing the black cars that I had overtaken on the other side, and he'd blocked out or not noticed the blue, the red, the grey cars, of course. So just because you have evidence for your theory doesn't make it correct. And Popper says this is true of horoscopes. Horoscopes have these wide open predictions to which almost anything acts as a confirmation. And Popper says, therefore, the verification principle, this idea that we can test a scientific theory with evidence and see if we can find evidence for it, is not good enough. So it's a good start, but it's not good enough. So Popper famously puts forward an alternative, the falsification principle. In Popper's falsification principle, what you should do is you should try and knock your theory over. And if your theory resists being knocked over, then it's a good one. Now, he points at a great example of this when Einstein's theory of relativity was tested with Eddington in 1919, because that was a very risky prediction, a very thin, narrow prediction, and the data exactly fitted. And Einstein at the time said, yeah, if I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I dump my theory. But as we know, he was right. So the falsification principle by Popper is an important contribution to the philosophy of science. It helps us think through what makes good science and how can we tell the difference between good science and pseudoscience or bad science. Now, let's apply this to another field. It's the same, says Popper, in politics. In politics, a government should be falsifiable. You should be able to question, interrogate, and ultimately get rid of a government if it's not doing the right job. So democracy, says Popper, is the best form of government because it acts like a kind of falsification principle. And his book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, is an attack on the dictatorships which happened in the 1940s. In fact, Popper himself had to flee from Vienna because he was Jewish, and he ended up in London and eventually New Zealand because of totalitarian systems, and these totalitarian systems which shut down dissent in all kinds of ways. Now let's apply it for individual psychology. What we can take from Popper is the importance of being willing to be wrong, and a willingness to be open to criticism. This is a signal of maturity. It's a signal of an open mind and an open heart. And our societies, which are seemingly increasingly in this kind of siloed state, are not open to voices of dissent. We don't have this democratic criticism where everybody is subject to falsification. And what this leads to is a siloing of individual psychology. And we saw in the previous chapter 11 on the psychology of climate change, that because of tribal commitments, some people just don't accept climate science. And they use their brain to manipulate data to filter out stuff that they don't want to hear. Now, there's an example of this from Popper's time. There were two scientists, German physicists, called Leonard and Stark, and they were both brilliant physicists. In fact, one of them had won a Nobel Prize. But in 1924, they wrote a paper called Hitler, Geist und Wissenschaft. So the spirit of Hitler and science. And essentially, this was science which got the name Deutsche Physik. It was a physics which blocked out Jewish people for a tribal commitment to the Aryan race and the Third Reich and so on. Well, not quite the Third Reich yet, but what would become the Third Reich. So a total commitment to blocking out stuff which doesn't fit with your political allegiances. And one of the people that gets blocked out, of course, is Einstein. It was a science which was against Einstein. And this put German science back decades in terms of quantum physics and ultimately delayed, fortunately, their development of nuclear energy and power. So these political beliefs blocked out proper, genuine scientific interrogation. And this is what we can learn as individuals. Okay, we can point the finger at the climate deniers and say, hey, just open yourselves up, guys. But also for ourselves, we should always be willing to have our beliefs falsified. If our strategies for climate change are not working, we should be willing and able to rethink them. So, in terms of psychology, Popper helps us put words on it. The principle of verification, the principle of falsification. Hannah Arendt on banality. Arendt is a remarkable thinker and writer, and trying to compress her thoughts into a small 5-10 minute window is in some ways absurd, but we're going to have a go because she's absolutely worth it. Arendt's breakthrough book was on the origins of totalitarianism, and it's worth quoting a line from that book to get us started. She said, "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, i.e. the reality of experience, and the distinction between true and false, i.e. the standards of thought, no longer exist." This was such a terrific insight into how people had been broken in both the regimes of Hitler and Stalin. It wasn't so much that these people had become convinced of Nazi ideas or communist ideas. The point was that they just abandoned themselves because the distinction between true and false had been battered so much. And this is what I think is wonderfully powerful as an insight into our modern situation. Because the number of conspiracy theories which you can see on the internet, or the number of absolutely ridiculous statements which come out of the White House, which are so obviously factually incorrect, but are said with such bombast and volume that people start to I just don't know anymore. And it's those people who, for whom the distinction between true and false doesn't exist anymore. This is the grounds for proper totalitarian control. So just as a warm-up, this is an indicator of the psychological perception of Hannah Arendt's work. And she was trying to analyze something which still had a raw power. In 1951, when she wrote The Origin of Totalitarianism, the Second World War still stuck in people's throat. So in some ways, it wasn't really appropriate to start psychoanalyzing what went on. It's like the Holocaust was just too real still. But Arendt was determined to not just regret the Holocaust and everything which happened, but to analyze it, to diagnose what went on in order for this to happen. How is it possible for people to have been bought by those systems? And her big insight is it was this decapitating of any distinction between true and false, which led eventually to the rise of these systems. We could, in fact, talk about it in terms of colonization. Arendt says, the 19th century was all about the colonization of land in Africa and Asia by European powers. But really, the 20th century was all about the colonization of the mind by these totalitarian systems. But like I said, these things are not just distant events. We're now facing the rise of the far right again. And as a root of that is this disorientation which happens about what is true and false. And in terms of climate change, we can see this with the rise of false information about climate. I even just in the last few weeks and months have noticed a tremendous increase in my own YouTube feed of people trying to put forward misinformation on climate change. So this disorientating effect is important, says Arendt, to keep a critical, open mind and to be thoughtful. And this is the key to the central thing I want to say about Arendt. And it's about banality. Because people who don't think anymore, people who lose their thoughtfulness, are capable of committing atrocities. And for this, Arendt focuses in her work later in the 60s on the famous trial of Adolf Eichmann. So Eichmann was the desk manager, he was the desk killer behind the Holocaust. He organized the trains that ran on time, that took people to their deaths in Auschwitz, and so on. And after the war, many of the top SS commandants and officials fled Germany and managed to escape. And this was true of Eichmann. He ended up in Argentina. But he was caught in the 1960s. He was bundled into the back of a car, taken on a flight, and brought to trial in Jerusalem. So her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, is an absolutely brilliant book analysing this man, Eichmann, and analysing what was going on in his head for this to be possible. The key insight of Hannah Arendt is that Eichmann was just banal. He had a cold during the trial. He had like a runny nose, and he seemed incapable of articulating basic statements. He forgot stuff, he couldn't remember stuff, he said the most trivial things. For example, Eichmann at one point in the trial said that he didn't tolerate violence in his office, as if his office was like an ethical space. Now, how can you say that when your office is basically responsible for Auschwitz? It requires a thoughtlessness of remarkable proportions, and in fact, Arendt calls this the banality of evil. At the very end of the book, she calls it, this is the banality of evil. That evil doesn't have to look like terror. It doesn't have to look like some devil with horns, or Hitler with a mustache, or Stalin. It doesn't have to look like a demonic force. It can just be banal. It can just be totally superficial responses to situations. Eichmann was proud of the train timetables, the fact that they were so efficient. But he didn't allow his thoughts to go down the tracks to the ultimate destination, which was a concentration camp. In fact, she quotes from Shakespeare. At the beginning of Richard III, he's having a talk with himself. It starts famously with the line, "Now is the winter of our discontent." And it goes on for a few lines, but then he notices his brother approaching, and he finishes this section with the line, "Dive thoughts into my soul. Here comes my brother, Clarence." So he is at this point, in a way, suppressing these dark schemes which he's cooking up. But the point Arendt is making about Richard III is at least he was talking to himself. At least he was in dialogue with himself. He might have come to some pretty sketchy conclusions and carried out some pretty terrible things in the end, but at least there was a thoughtfulness in him. At least there was a dialogue going on. And in the case of Eichmann, that just seemed to be absent. He was just acting at such a superficial level. Now, how do we translate this insight into how humans are capable of banality and how it can lead to genocidal consequences? Well, in terms of climate change, it's really difficult because the situation which we live in terms of our consumption and our economies is that there's a complete mismatch between consumption, which at the surface level feels good, like a honeymoon on a tropical island. The amount of energy and fossil fuel it takes to do that honeymoon in the end leads to this destruction of that tropical island through sea level rises. And that mismatch between good and evil is really weird. Likewise, a children's birthday party where there are beef burgers. Well, how can we reconcile the fact that those beef burgers are going to undermine the future of those children's lives? It's just not, we can't handle all of that. So it's easy for us to just shut down and ignore the consequences of our actions. And like I said, this is especially difficult in climate change because at the surface level, these actions are wonderful. Like buying a bunch of flowers or chocolates, like consumption is good. It feels good and it is good. But because it's plugged into a system which is dysfunctional, because it's producing emissions at a rate which is pushing our planetary boundaries, then we get this massive dissonance. And so the easiest thing to do is just to unplug and just to function at this banal surface level. Now, like I said, Arendt, I have a book on Arendt. Arendt tackles climate change. I'll try and make it available somehow. I don't have a publisher yet, but this book ended up being pages long because she's such an insightful thinker on bureaucracies, on psychology and everything. And I know that in the end, she discovered, it was pointed out that Eichmann actually did know very well what he was doing. He was just performing his banality. That doesn't invalidate the insights which Arendt has into the nature of evil, that evil sometimes doesn't have to be dark and demonic. It can just be banal. Pain on heresy. To finish this rather deep dive into all these different philosophers and thinkers, we finish with Thomas Paine. And his ideas are important because he put words on things for the American colonies just as they started to rebel and revolt against the mothership, England and London and King George. And his book, Common Sense, just was a very direct way to speak to people, to mobilize them to fulfill the project of independence. So here the parallel is that we need to put words on things. This is actually a theme of this whole chapter. The importance of being able to put words on things. You could see it with Freud, you can see it with Nietzsche, and here with Paine. If you can put words on things, it's empowering. So, the context for Paine. It's 1776 when the book is published, and at the time, the colonists were not getting much from England. They were paying their taxes, but what in return? They didn't even have a vote in the English Parliament. So this absurd asymmetry led many people to rebel. But because this idea of the royal family and all the regal things that go with it, and because people were dedicated to England and Britishness, it was a very painful divorce for some people. They couldn't let go of the idea that they were being screwed by the mothership. And so the book Common Sense by Paine is an attempt to crystallize and make clear that no, this is right. You need to kick away the ladder of control between Britain and the colonies. And the book was so influential. It's like one of the most influential books ever written. The sales of the book were through the roof. It's still one of the biggest selling books in American history. It's still quoted more than any other book in presidential speeches, because Paine was calling out and, as I said, putting words on these injustices and inequalities in plain language. That's really weird for us to think about this, because if you look at an image of George III, you think, what? Why would you have any kind of spiritual or emotional connection to such a pompous image? How could that image have sway over people? How could people tolerate injustices and not rebel when they're being done over? Why did people not rebel earlier? And this is again a theme of this chapter, like with Marx, how inequality is camouflaged and masked, how we live in these like psychological cages and we're being exploited, we're being done over, and yet somehow we interpret it or flip it so we don't experience it as subjugation or as enslavement or as exploitation. So having a clear mind is critical, both in the 18th century with the American Revolution, but also today with climate change. And when you look at that image of George III, it's really mad to think that that kind of propaganda had any kind of impact to keep people from rebelling, but it did. And it took a tremendous amount of psychological energy to push people into an act of rebellion to fight the War of Independence and eventually gain their independence. And I think there's a parallel today with climate change and billionaires and fossil fuels. In climate change today, although it doesn't dress itself up in ridiculous costumes, crowns and ceremony, we still live with an absurd acceptance of monumental amounts of public wealth being given and spent in the fossil fuel industry. Their profits are through the roof every year. And in fact, it's not just profits. The IMF has a report which is annually updated, which points to the fact that every year, last year was $7 trillion worth of subsidies, not profit, subsidies. So this is wealth which is taken from the public and given through government apparatus to the fossil fuel industry. 7 trillion. Now, to be clear, the majority of this subsidy is implicit subsidy, not explicit subsidy. So less than 1 trillion of it is actually like $1 taken and given through some sort of bank transaction. The implicit subsidies are the costs to us in terms of environmental impact and health impact. For example, if you have a coal-powered fire station which is spitting out polluting dust and dirt, then your hospitals are going to be full of people with cancer. Now, that's never considered in the great scheme of things, apart from in this IMF report. So when you add together all of these implicit impacts of allowing the fossil fuel industry to keep burning its fossil fuels and the environmental impact, you get to this monumental amount of 7 trillion. Now, how is that possible? How can we tolerate such a level of injustice and such a transfer of wealth to a small group of companies with massive profits and salaries and shareholders and wealth which doesn't go into the hands of the ordinary people? It's amazing. It's amazing that this is not a central question of our time in parliaments, in media. It's like, well, we can't disturb we need our energy stability, and this thing has worked in the past, so it's going to work. We should allow it to work in the future. These like clumsy, stupid cliches that people live under. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Thomas Paine was championing and fighting against in his book Common Sense. He was saying to the American colonists, hey guys, wake up. Like, this is such an asymmetrical situation. What are you doing? You need to just get up, mobilize, and push away the mothership. and have an independent life, a democratic one. Paine is a tremendous champion of democracies. He was actually marginalized after the revolution. But anyway, that's a story for another day. So in terms of psychology, Paine on heresy, we have to have heretical thoughts, not about weird kings with crowns, but heretical thoughts about the status quo and billionaires and the fossil fuel industry. We need more heresy.